Thanks, Andrew. Well, no whiskey here tonight, unfortunately. Welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Markson. Let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Albanese has rushed through the tax cut changes to take pressure off his leadership, but now it's on the line more than ever. I'll discuss the impact with leading journalist Terry McCrann. The Prime Minister's also reheated a Kevin Rudd policy from 2008, targeting the supermarkets. I'll speak about this with James Patterson later in the show. And what will the new chair, Kim Williams, bring to the ABC? I'll speak with a man who locked horns with him more than once, former editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell. Also tonight, a Liberal politician has spoken about the terrifying moment a man tried to break into her house in a frightening home invasion. We're gonna hear from her a bit later in the show. But first tonight, the Prime Minister...
My word is my bond.
We haven't changed our position.
I've said we haven't changed our position.
We haven't changed our position on the Stage 3 tax cuts.
We have not changed our position on Stage 3 tax cuts.
They've been legislated. We support them. We have changed our position. Changed our position. We've changed our position for the right reasons.
Albanese has put his leadership on the line as he breaks a major election promise. Tonight, I can reveal that Labor sources claim the changes to the tax policy were rushed forward ahead of the Dunkley by-election, with the tax cuts helping around 87% of people in the seat. The contest in the seat of Dunkley in early March is shaping up as a major test for the Prime Minister. Albanese's favourability has been sinking in the polls. Labor was in the danger zone in this by-election, sparked by the death of popular local MP Peter Murphy. If Labor loses Dunkley, Albanese will be under enormous leadership pressure. Already within the party, speculation about his potential rivals and successors has already begun. The top candidates are Jim Chalmers, Tanya Plibersek, and bizarrely, and I'll never understand this, Tony Burke. Albanese has been under pressure since The Voice. After the defeat, there was a magazine profile feature where former Prime Minister and Labor heavyweight Paul Keating all but endorsed Jim Chalmers as the next Prime Minister. The suburban outer metropolitan seat of Dunkley has a margin of 6.5%. It's the fulcrum point for the change of government. Labor has around 15 seats with margins less than Dunkley. So if Dunkley goes, there'll be many nervous MPs potentially agitating for a change of leader. The Dunkley electorate has a median income of $43,000, according to the ABS. So voters there will be in the sweet spot for these tax cuts. And families living in Dunkley have high cost of living pressures, especially with their mortgages. Several Labor sources told me today that Dunkley played a role in the timing of the changes Albanese announced. One Labor figure said the by-election date on the 3rd of March meant that all of this was brought forward, that it could have been done in the May budget. Another Labor source said that Albanese, desperate to hold on to his leadership, decided to break his election promise and take the credibility hit now for the bigger immediate prize of winning Dunkley and securing his prime ministership. Dutton had presumably heard similar information because he made these comments this afternoon.
And I'd say to the people of Dunkley and to the broader Australian people, if this Prime Minister is prepared to look your neighbour in the eye and lie to him or her, you are next. I think the Prime Minister is in all sorts of trouble. I think he's panicked. I think he's worried about his own position as leader within the Labor Party. And as we saw with Julia Gillard, this is a slippery slope.
But there's also the question over whether Albanese has now fatally damaged his prime ministership. This broken promise could end his career and ultimately put Jim Chalmers in the lodge. It has been a discussion point within the Labor Party today. One Labor source told me everyone in caucus is saying that for Jim, this is tails I win, heads you lose. Another Labor source said This is all downside for Albanese. He talked about integrity in politics. My word is my bond. Another Labor figure said that Chalmers clearly has leadership talent, so the faster Albanese goes, the faster he rises. They said he's a genuine working person, which is actually where Labor needs to be. One insider said whether this broken promise is for Albanese a flesh wound or a major suicide note will depend on how Dutton responds. If he decides to match the larger tax cuts for lower income Australians and also commit to stage 3, or whether he opposes Labor's proposal altogether. But everyone I spoke to today admitted that this was an extraordinary political moment. Albanese putting his credibility, his prime ministership on the line by breaking an election promise. Even though the man himself refused to actually admit in so many words that it was a broken promise when he was asked about it again and again by the journalists at the press club.
But things like the pandemic, the recession, the war in Ukraine, they were known when you went to the election in May 2022. So when you name those factors as reasons for this change, aren't you just looking for excuses here? Why didn't you level with voters at the election in May 2022?
Last week, when asked on radio if you were committed to delivering the stage 3 tax cuts as promised, you said, "We're committed to that." Do you accept that this was a lie?
I'm the Prime Minister. I am in a position to do something about it. We are doing something about it, and it's the right thing to do.
I'm sorry, but the question wasn't, is this good or bad policy? It's, do you believe you lied?
You promised to do politics differently, to bring integrity, honesty back to politics. Isn't it important, therefore, that you level with the Australian people today and admit that you breached an election commitment? Is that something you can do?
Not sure if you were here for the speech, Joe.
A joke? Breaching the trust of the electorate is hardly a laughing matter. The Prime Minister tried to justify his lies by saying he followed process and went through Cabinet, caucus and sought advice from Treasury. But that doesn't explain away the lie, the blatant lie. And even after he knew that he was reworking the stage 3 tax cuts over summer, he still continued to mislead voters by claiming in multiple media interviews that he was committed to them. So, according to Albanese's logic, as he made the case today at the press club, it's okay to repeatedly lie to Australians over and over again if Treasury says it is and if you get the sign-off from Cabinet. Well, Albanese should have told Australians that they were open to changing the stage 3 tax cuts instead of lying and treating voters like fools. But aside from the broken promise and the political cost that this will undoubtedly have, this is also hijacking tax reform. Labor has called off the removal of unfair tax brackets to serve a short-term goal. Bracket creep, as we've been speaking about all week, is imposing the largest in a generation tax rise on Australians. It's a tax rise by stealth. The tax thresholds for high-income Australians haven't been adjusted in 16 years since 2008, and they still won't be. Those who now fall into the top tax bracket are many average Australians who are struggling to afford a mortgage and to even live in major cities. But tonight, I can also reveal some of the inside detail about the messaging that Albanese wants his politicians to speak about, and it shows what they are worried about internally. I understand that Albanese told Labor MPs last night at caucus not to pitch this as about fairness. They don't want to hear about fairness. They don't want this to be seen as class warfare, which turned voters off ahead of the 2019 election. Instead, they want this pitched as the solution to the cost of living crisis. Now, if they're telling caucus this clear messaging, you'd presume that they've had research done on how best to sell this broken promise. But as you and I know, it doesn't matter what they call this. This is a classic Labor redistribution of wealth. This is class warfare. Albanese also told MPs that they needed to go out and sell this as Labor's tax cuts. And the ad material released by the party today backs this messaging up.
Every taxpayer will pay less tax. Labor's cost of living tax cut is part of our economic plan.
Albanese and Chalmers were not prepared to spend $250 billion or more delivering the Liberals, delivering Scott Morrison's tax cuts. For such a major budget expenditure, they wanted to take the credit. So tweaking the package like they have means that they can now claim that they're delivering Labor's tax cuts and that that's what the opposition would be opposing if Dutton does decide to oppose them. Now, in caucus last night, I understand that only 2 Labor MPs were brave enough to ask questions about this policy. One was Dr Michelle Anandaraja, the member for Higgins, the other Sally Situ from Reid in New South Wales. And Mike Friedlander from Macarthur asked if the government would also increase funding for Food Bank to help those who couldn't afford to eat. The vibe otherwise, I'm told, from Labor was positive. Most Labor politicians didn't agree with the Stage 3 tax cuts in the first place. They felt they were too generous to the top end of town. But as we spoke about last night, the cost of living package only amounts to about $18 extra a week for low-income Australians. This isn't major, and the Greens complained about this today.
Why is Labor expecting people to be happy with an additional $15 a week when rents have gone up by about $100 a week under Labor's housing and rental crisis and mortgages almost $200 a week? Is this really the best that Labor can do?
Among Adam Band's many failings, he can't do maths. It is actually $18 a week. But Peter Dutton made the point that these tax cuts might give people $18 a week, but over the longer term, he says keeping the 37% tax bracket will mean the government will end up reaping a multi-billion-dollar tax windfall. Now, even if voters ultimately support Labor's tax changes today, because many more will benefit than will be hit by it, the question remains, will they forgive Albanese for the blatant election lie, or has he now permanently damaged his credibility? For Peter Dutton, the election ads write themselves.
The Prime Minister has knowingly and willingly lied to the Australian people. And I don't think the Australian people will easily forget or forgive.
All right, joining me now to discuss this, Sky News host Danica DiGiorgio and commentator Jason Morrison. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
Jason, so Albanese is making the calculation that 12 to 1, for every one person who loses out under his changes, 12 people will benefit. But what do you think about the proposition that voters will begin to not trust him anymore because they can't believe what he says?
Well, the trust is gone, and it's an irreversible thing now. There's not much he can ever really say that people will believe. But the test will be the payslip. The payslip's going to come, and what was the number? $18? So you just told me?
A week, yeah.
$18. People are going to look at that and go, this is bullshit. I mean, where's the big breakthrough for my life? Most people's living costs, I mean, just in power bills alone, have gone up vastly higher than that. So, you know, that's the test. And I think, you know, you're looking for, they can use every clever political technique they like, but the test will be in 6 months' time, will people look and say, life is better for me now? And I think the answer is there. The answer is it won't be.
I mean, that's the thing, Danica. People will happily take the additional money. It's not much. I think you're right, Jason. I thought about that today, $18 a week. I mean, people's power bills have gone up by 30% or more, hundreds of dollars. So the extra $900 a year, if you're on low income, would disappear so quickly just in regular household budgets. So they're not going to sit there and think at the next election, oh, we're so grateful to the Prime Minister for making life more affordable when it's clearly not.
No, it's clearly not. And that $900, as you say, probably just makes up for maybe what they've lost over, you know, a certain amount of time. But look, I just want to point out what you revealed there before, Sharri, about that this is a possibility that this has been rushed through ahead of the Dunkley by-election. And we know that Albanese is watching that one particularly closely because that will also be a very big test of his leadership. It's very clear that Labor has done some internal polling here. They've gone there and they've realised that they're not doing too well. They've rushed this through, and I just think they're playing some class warfare here, whether they think they are or not. That's exactly what they're trying to do. And Albanese can spin this any way that he wants. Today he was out saying changed circumstances, changed economic circumstances. If that's the case, why didn't you do this 12 months ago? And then stand at the National Press Club today and basically say, no, it's not a broken promise. It is. Does he think that we're all idiots?
Yeah, it would have been much more honest to say, look, I realise I've broken a promise, not his language of changing position. But Jason, what about all this leadership speculation that's coming from within Labor? You can tell it's coming from within Labor because there's no way Tony Burke would be on my list.
That's right.
As a future Prime Minister, I mean, what is this? It's fascinating that we're halfway through the Albo term and Labor people are already saying, well, he's damaged. If he falls over, then, you know, who will it be?
But, OK, look, who's option 2? Jim Chalmers, probably?
Jim Chalmers, Tanya Plibersek, Tony Burke.
Jim Chalmers never had a real job in the real world outside of politics. 2 university degrees, straight into political life. That's his life. Like, that guy is the treasurer of Australia. Now, I'm not saying the alternative's better. I'm just saying you've got a problem there because the unworldliness that has us in this position right now, the misreading of the tides, the misreading of what people are about, this cost of living situation has been a boiling issue in the community 12, 18 months. And they're onto it now because it showed up in some kind of polling. They're panicking now because I guess it's real. But if the alternative is, let's go to the public with a brand new guy who's just like the other guy. He's a class warrior. He's not really done a hell of a lot with his life and he's never really made a product anyone's ever wanted. And suddenly he's going to be in charge and that will be the solution. What you've got here is it's sort of this political class that just think everything's about branding. Australians are so much wiser than that and they can smell it from a long way away and they can smell emptiness. And they're seeing emptiness in the Prime Minister and those who surround him, unfortunately. And while you've got Chris Bowen in the corner looking at every possible way to increase baseline costs of everybody's living, that is the energy price in Australia, he's actively looking for a way to do it. What are you going to do? How's Australia going to be better off, even if we change the jockey?
Well, he did send Jim Chalmers out to clean up the mess this morning. Jim Chalmers was on a media blitz this morning, so no doubt that was a strategy in itself. Whether or not he did that properly or not, I don't think he did, because it was the same old excuses.
I think the difference is, you know, Albanese often speaks about his Housing Commission background. We saw him refer to it at the press club appearance today. But really, his political instincts have been surprisingly bad since he became Prime Minister. The whole of last year, we were sitting here on Sky News saying cost of living is the main issue, and all you hear from the Prime Minister was The Voice. So I think whereas Jim Chalmers does, you know, his electorate of Logan, it is working Australians. Albanese from Marrickville, who's always been on the far left of the Labor Party, he's you know, comes from that radical left background. That's his approach to the Israel issue as well. And he just seems to have lost touch, or his political instincts have been so far off. And Danica, this today is the latest example of that thinking that a broken promise will just, you know, people will accept it.
Well, he's treating us all like mugs, as I said, and he's gone from saying to us, I am a man of my word, I am this, you know, he paints himself as this man of integrity and then has the nerve to come out and do this to Australians at a time where he's known that the cost of living crisis, I mean, that he was elected on this. This is what he promised the Australian people. And he was elected on stage 3 tax cuts, and he probably wouldn't have gotten over the line had it not been for that policy. So stop treating us like we're idiots. We know what you're doing.
Yeah, if he had
Aussies
said...
have seen this all before, haven't they?
Correct.
No carbon tax under the government I leave.
Exactly.
They've seen it all before and they sniff it from a mile off. And
they do.
It's an irreversible situation for him. He's gone. It's just a question of when. It'll either be by his own team or by the public.
Oh, look, I think it is still a big ask for the Liberals to make up 22 seats for the next federal election, but he's seriously damaged. He could be gone. It could be a minority government that they're looking at.
Minority government's as good as gone. If you're going to sit there with those crackerjacks from the other side and sit there and negotiate everything through, remember what Gillard had to go through to try to run Australia with Bob Brown and the gang. I mean, that's the prospect that's sort of lingering there if they end up in a minority situation. I call that gone.
Look, before we go, let's talk about Australia Day. Peter Dutton held a press conference today where he accused the Prime Minister of also not showing leadership when it comes to Australia Day. Danica, do you think he could have done a better job defending our National Day, seeing as we do still have a public holiday tomorrow?
Absolutely. Well, he hasn't come out yet at all and said that he's a proud Australian. that he's proud to be an Australian, that he supports Australia Day. All we heard from him this week in an interview at Sky News, he said, I think people need to stop finding things to be agitated about or angry about, were along his words. So he hasn't shown leadership on this matter from the very beginning. And we are a divided nation. It has gone back now to the Voice referendum. That's where it began. It divided the nation, and the ramifications are still being held, and there is no leadership on the matter. Nobody from Labor has the spine to stand up and say we should be a proud country, we should embrace our country.
All right, Jason, just quick 30-second because we're out of time.
Well, there's people in Melbourne lopping off statues because they think it's acceptable to do it, because there is not a groundswell of anger at a leadership level that this sort of stuff is absolutely unacceptable in our country. It's gone on, and, you know, where's the hunt for them right now? That would be interesting, as opposed to the rationalisation of it. Yeah. That's the thing I think that makes people sick, regardless of their views about where Australia's at or going. Yeah, and we're going to get back to that vandalised statue a bit later in the show. Jason Morris and Danica Di Giorgio, thank you both so much. Thanks. Now, ABC's news boss, Justin Stevens, is holding listening sessions with culturally diverse staff and all-staff weekly town halls as the ABC tries to keep its people, its journalists, in line. Dozens have been in open revolt since the sacking of fill-in host Antoinette Lattouf over posts she made about the Gaza war. And these revolts are all happening before the new ABC chair, Kim Williams, takes over from Ita Buttrose. We already know, thanks to his book published in 2014, that he thinks the ABC is in need of serious reform. As we spoke about last night, Williams said ABC executives were guilty of pompous twaddle. He slammed the broadcaster's lack of news breaking, its vanity, its self-congratulatory nature. Kim Williams was a successful boss of Foxtel for a decade, but then he had a bitter departure from the role of CEO at News Corp after clashing with editorial leaders. One of the editors, partly responsible for Williams leaving the company, is the former editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell. He joined me a little earlier. Chris Mitchell, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Sharri.
Now, you worked closely with Kim Williams when you were editor-in-chief of The Australian newspaper. It seems that from day one in the role, he managed to get senior leaders, senior editors offside. What happened?
Well, I think there's a pretty famous story written in the Fairfaxes about Kim's day one assembling all the national leaders from the company in the theaterette downstairs at Holt Street and reading them the Riot Act, which possibly wasn't the smartest way to win over the support of 15,000 people.
He spoke about how editors shouldn't rely on their gut instinct. What else did he say that offended editors like you at the time?
Well, look, I wasn't offended, but he talked about editors relying on, proper marketing rather than their tummy compass. He sort of indicated to the crowd that he would get his way. He used a Hollywood term called grin effing, which apparently meant something to some of the staff, not to most editorial people, I wouldn't have thought. But look, I think the truth is it was a difficult time. We all thought Kim's was probably a smart appointment, given he'd come from a digital business like Foxtel. But I think quite early on in the piece, it became clear that a lack of publishing background was not counting strongly in his favour.
What was your experience of the quite extreme and radical reforms that he tried to implement at News?
Well, I guess what I'd say, Sharri, is, I noticed that the Sydney Morning Herald this morning talked about, editors needed to be driven into digital journalism. Well, the truth of it is we'd launched paid content at The Australian a year before Kim's arrival, and in his first few months in the job, he raised with me the possibility of leading the way by shutting the print product and going digital only, which was bit of a surprise to me, given the paper at the time had 350 staff, and probably 99% of its revenue at the time was coming from print. So, you know, I set about trying to explain to Kim, you know, the relative financial strengths of the digital product in 2012 versus the print product. And I think it's quite instructive, Sharri, that here we are 12 years almost to the day after that conversation, and the print version of the Oz still exists.
Chris, you eventually outlined your concerns in a letter to Rupert Murdoch, your concerns about the direction that Kim Williams was taking the company. I'm guessing that trying to shut down the newspapers was one of those. What unfolded after that?
Well, I guess it was a difficult year for all concerned, and certainly difficult for the proprietor as well. But I think what Rupert understood, and most editors understood, was that the bond between the company, the proprietor and an editor is pretty important to the proper functioning of any newsroom. I mean, Rupert would have expected his editors to defend their mastheads. That would be what the proprietor expected, and actually it should have been what Kim himself expected if he understood publishing.
With this history, how do you think Kim Williams is going to go at the ABC?
Well, look, I mean, Kim was a very successful chief executive at Foxtel. You know, obviously, the pay TV world was on an upswing in most Western countries at the time, so at some level he rode that. But he also undoubtedly turned Foxtel around, and, you know, he lifted it from a fairly dismal financial performance on his arrival to one of the sort of showpieces of the company by the time he got the chief executive job at News. So, you know, I think he comes with the background to understand what's going on at the ABC. He's a brilliant man, very widely read, prodigious memory. But I guess, you know, in some respects, Sharri, he reminds me a lot of another similar sort of person in Kevin Rudd, that, you know, the person who is the smartest person in the room doesn't always read the room best. And I would argue that both Kevin and Kim lack a certain amount of emotional intelligence. And that's an emotional intelligence that is needed if you're going to drive change. So I think it's hard to be on the board of the ABC, and particularly to be its chair, and really manage change. I actually don't think the managing director, David Anderson, will be able to manage change either. In some ways, you know, the ABC has so much momentum, and as Gerard Henderson often calls it, it is a staff collective. So, you know, whether management or the board can ever really shepherd the corporation in one direction or another is dubious to my mind. If you go back right to Donald McDonald's appointment, you know, one of John Howard's closest friends, right through Maurice Newman, and, you know, various other people who've been appointed to the chair, or board people such as Michael Kroger or Janet Albrechtsen, there's no real evidence that any of those changes affected the corporation. Very good points. And look, I played on the show last night. Kim Williams, in his own book, was critical that the ABC wasn't doing enough in its core functions in terms of breaking news. So we will see if he's able to effect any change, if he's able to correct the bias and the anti-Semitism in reporting, which, again, he has said in the past is an important issue. Chris Mitchell, thank you so much for your insights. Thanks for having me, Sharri. Well, that was former Editor-in-Chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, comparing Kim Williams to Kevin Rudd. Well, after the break, Albanese rushed through the tax cut changes to take pressure off his leadership. But does this broken promise only invite leadership speculation? I'll discuss the fallout with leading business journalist Terry McCrann after this break. Welcome back. Well, we've been speaking about how the Stage 3 tax cuts were designed to address bracket creep. But after Labor's broken promise, Herald Sun business writer Terry McCrann this week writes that it's Albanese and Chalmers who are the new bracket creeps. And Terry, the man himself, joins me now. Welcome to the program, Very Funny Line. Terry, what's your assessment on the broken promise on Stage 3 tax cuts announced today by Albanese? And do you think this is classic Labor wealth redistribution?
Short answer, yes, Sharri, to that second question. The first question, obviously, is the broken promise. I mean, that's absolutely clear-cut. It's absolutely undeniable, although I don't think the Prime Minister's doing his credibility, his battered credibility, any great credit by attempting to sort of pretend that it's not a broken promise. But I think more fundamentally, what's got lost in this discussion, Sharri, is what we are seeing is a proposal to dramatically increase the rate of taxation on anyone earning more than $135,000. Now, $135,000 used to be a high income. It's not such a high income today. I mean, many people in the trade union movement, and particularly in some of the key unions, are earning those sorts of sums and considerably higher. So this is a direct attack by increasing from 30 cents, which is currently the law. It's come July 1, the law is that somebody on 135,000 plus would face a marginal tax rate of 30 cents. This is increasing that to 37 cents. So you are getting a tax hike, not a reduced tax cut. And then secondly, as you've indicated, Sharri, bracket creep. The old fingers of bracket creep into your any increases in pay you get and take 30 cents, at least 30 cents in the dollar of any increase.
So look, just picking up on that point. So under the original stage 3 tax cuts, you would have had 30 cents in the dollar for everyone earning from $45,000 to $200,000. Now it's going to return to the 37% bracket. So as you say, that is a tax hike. But also, what does this mean for the fact that the tax thresholds then won't have been adjusted since 2008? I mean, this is good for the budget bottom line. I mean, this is why they're doing it, isn't it? For more revenue.
Well, absolutely, Sharri. I mean, Willie Sutton, that famous Depression-era bank robber, was asked, why do I rob banks? And he said, that's because that's where the money is. And where the money is in the Australian economy are ordinary, the 15 million plus ordinary Australian workers, ordinary Australian taxpayers, and the taxes on their incomes contribute by far the biggest amount of tax that the federal government raises. Second, of course, is company tax, and a much lower figure. So this government, all governments, are not about cutting the taxes on ordinary Australians. They are about increasing them, and they either do it, and they found this magic pudding of bracket creep. By having these high tax brackets, you don't have to actually say, we want to lift taxes. You just let inflation, you just let wage increases increase the amount of tax, the percentage of tax that ordinary Australians suffer. So we've had a situation, Sharri, where wages have been failing to keep pace with inflation, and on top of that, a bigger slice of those under pressure wages have been taken in income tax. So it's been a double hit. And what the government has done is made that considerably worse than it would have been if the stage 3 tax cuts were not going to be repealed.
Look, you've made the point that originally, the government claimed that, the budget figures were forecasting a deficit of $56 billion in this coming financial year. That's when the stage 3 tax cuts were supposed to start. Now the budget numbers forecast a deficit of just $1 billion. So it's not like they couldn't have afforded to stick with their election promise, fulfil stage 3, but perhaps give more cost of living relief as well to vulnerable Australians, and no one would have objected to that.
Exactly, Sharri. I mean, clearly the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, worked up this patter of saying all these things have changed. We've had a global pandemic. We've had the incredible impact of the war in Ukraine, and et cetera, and this has changed things. So we have to change things, But the critically important point, Sharri, as you've indicated, is that when the promise was made in May 2022, we knew all those things. We knew about COVID. We knew about the recovery from COVID. We knew about the inflation that we were beginning to experience. And secondly, they were prepared to make that promise to keep the tax cuts, knowing that they were facing a big budget deficit. Now they're facing a budget surplus. So there's no way you can argue that the tax cuts can't be afforded. What this government could have done was maintain the stage 3 tax cuts and deliver that targeted tax relief to lower and middle income earners. They could have had their cake and allowed taxpayers to eat it at the same time.
And no one would have complained and there would have been no broken promise. It's
absolutely
really quite perplexing why the Prime Minister didn't do that, and it makes you worried about his political instincts and his advisors. Terry McCrann, thank you so much for your time. Now, the Trump train is gathering steam, but will media bias pour water on his fire once again? Kosha Gada and Matt Canavan will join me after this. Welcome back. Well, leftist media are falling over themselves to try and paint Donald Trump's win in the New Hampshire primary as a loss. The ABC insists that he was angry during his New Hampshire run, saying the primary exposed some weakness in the former president. The Sydney Morning Herald criticised American voters for choosing Trump's chaos over rival Nikki Haley's normality. And The Guardian slammed Trump's cruelty, calling him a schoolyard bully. The Guardian writes, like many bullies, Trump's ostentatious show of strength was motivated by inner weakness. Haley did well enough among independents to raise red flags for Republicans in the general election. It's like no one in the progressive left learned their lesson from 2016. The more the media seems to attack Donald Trump, the more his popularity soars. Well, joining me now, Sky News contributor Kosha Gada and National Senator Matt Canavan. Welcome to you both. Matt, how did you interpret Trump's New Hampshire win, and do you think that it's only a matter of time before Nikki Haley has to withdraw?
Look, I think it's pretty hard to see Donald Trump not being the nominee here. He has pretty much record-breaking leads in the polls among Republicans. I don't know. I just think it's almost all over now. Seemingly. I mean, in terms of what Nikki Haley decides to do, who knows? I suppose there's perhaps other benefits in her staying in the race, but you really can't see anything but Donald Trump taking the nomination here for the Republican Party. And he's obviously tapping into a level of frustration that exists with institutions in America. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. Someone up for trial, someone that's been indicted on different issues is leading in the polls by this much. And I think hopefully it's a bit of a wake-up call to all the political class to start taking the issues that average people across the world are concerned about seriously. They want to protect borders. They want to make sure their own economies grow. They don't want to see their jobs move offshore to other countries that aren't complying with radical climate action. Just deal with the issues that people want, and then you'll get support among them. You don't need any tricks behind the scenes to do that.
Kosha, the pressure among some Republicans who support Trump, the pressure on Nikki Haley to step down, to withdraw, seems to be heating up. She is under pressure. She seems to be resisting it at this point and standing firm. Do you think she presents a good alternative to Trump should a black swan event happen?
It's very hard to see how that would be the case. I mean, there are any number of reasons for why she's persisting. She is under a lot of pressure because the GOP has finite resources, money, et cetera, and the more this continues, it's sort of diverging or it's a diversion tactic away from the general, which everybody wants them to get on with. The reason I say it's unlikely is because her constituency, at best, really is independents. There was a lot of discussion that came about that, how in New Hampshire she had a good showing with independents. There's some question about how many of them are true independents versus Democrats in disguise, or even other people in disguise just register as independents. But be that as it may, in a primary she may do well with independents, but in a general there's no evidence that says those people will continue to go with her against the Democrat. And you cannot run as a Republican nominee without having the core Republican base on your side. So the independents are sort of like icing on the cake, but you have to have the cake of the Republicans. And the point is the Republican Party is being remade in the image of the populist movement, the MAGA movement. That is what is ascendant, as evidenced by Trump's performance in 16, 20, and right now. And she just doesn't have that constituency behind her. So it doesn't make sense really how she would be the natural heir apparent to Trump in the case of a black swan event.
I mean, she points out that she's come so far. Her polling originally was only 2% and, now she's the last one standing. Matt, the Democrats also seem to want Trump to be the Republican nominee. The theory is, at least they say, that Biden can beat Trump. The polling doesn't show that, though. But how do you think Nikki Haley would go against Joe Biden?
Look, it's a bit hard to say because I don't think Nikki Haley has been subjected to the blowtorch of a national political campaign. So I think when you do sort of polling of a candidate like Nikki Haley, who's probably not known that well to many Americans, the results you get are not going to be a true representation of what might happen after months of political combat. And no one really does political combat more confrontationally than in the United States. So, there'll probably be a lot more coming, I suppose, to Nikki if she stays in the race, and will that affect her polls? It's a bit hard to say if she go into general, but I agree there with Moksha that look, it's hard to see how Nikki Haley captures the now populist nationalist part of the Republican Party. She's almost harkening back to the George W. Bush era, which seems like a long way back in the rearview mirror now. Donald Trump really is ascendant within the Republican Party and represents a very different type of conservatism: anti-war, anti-foreign entanglements, strong security of the borders, obviously an America First agenda. So, look, I don't see any other viable option for the Republican Party but to go with Trump, and it'll be a contestable, difficult election, but it's probably their best hope of a change of administration.
Look, let's have a quick look at the Middle East. Kosha, we know that Qatar has been acting as somewhat of a broker between Israel and Hamas, but the Qatar Foreign Ministry is reportedly fuming over Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's comments in Israeli media, where he's criticised Qatar for its role in harbouring the terrorist leaders. He's also criticised the United States for not putting enough pressure on Qatar to release the hostages. Doesn't Israel have a point here, Kosha? These countries are providing safe haven to the terrorist leaders and their billions of dollars.
They certainly do, and you ask a very legitimate question, Sharri, and the whole apparatus of Qatar has actually been a slow brewing story. The fact that it's quite underappreciated and underreported on, even well before October 7th, and now post-October 7th just puts a sharper spotlight on it. Often the answer to these things, not always, is money. And if you look at that, it's a very rich country. They've been very successful in establishing a pretty entrenched lobbying apparatus, funding apparatus within the United States government, certainly, and probably other governments like it around the world. There was an FBI case last year where they seized data and files of the CEO of the Brookings Institute, which is a very influential preeminent think tank in Washington, D.C., because allegedly he was doing some improper lobbying on behalf of Qatar. I think it's since been dismissed, but that gives you a signal. And then there's been other allegations. I think Fox News just reported 3 days ago that there's some sort of spy ring, Qatari spy ring that they've caught, where they're trying to put pressure on U.S. legislators that are trying to actually be tougher on Qatar and trying to get them to turn over Hamas or declaring the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, et cetera. So if you look into those things, it may start to give a piece of the answer as to why there isn't more pressure being put on Qatar, despite their obvious role in housing Hamas.
Matt Canavan, just before we go, I'd love to quickly ask you what you think the coalition's response should be to Albanese's proposed tax cuts today. Do you think the coalition should support Labor's new tax package?
Well, number one, we should continue to pursue the stage 3 tax cuts as promised. Promises should be delivered, and so I continue to support that. In terms of today's announcements, look, obviously I'll have to get across the detail, but I'm sure Liberal national parties will always support lower taxes on Australians. And today's announcement, where the government has ripped away thousands of dollars of promised tax cuts from Australians, just demonstrates and highlights that you will always pay higher taxes under a Labor government.
So just to get that straight, so you think Labor's proposal today, the additional tax cuts that they're offering for low-income earners should go ahead, but the high-income earners and the stage 3 changing of the tax brackets should remain as well?
Well, as I said, I've got to get across those details. It's been announced in the last few hours. There's been a lot of speculation the last few days, but I've only had a few hours, so let me do that. But as I say, I'd always like to see lower taxes on Australians. But I don't believe in this approach of punishing some Australians to help others. This is not the way to pursue tax reform. It doesn't incentivise aspiration. We've got to find a way we can lower taxes for all Australians, whereas the Prime Minister today has raised taxes on over 1 million Australians, and I definitely oppose that.
All right. Matt Canavan, Kosha Gada, thank you both so much. Now, still to come, Labor re-announces a Kevin Rudd policy from 2008 during the global financial crisis. More details after the break with James Patterson. Welcome back. We'll talk about the top story tonight, Albanese's broken promise on stage 3 tax cuts. Let's bring in the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, James Patterson. James, welcome. Does the coalition plan to support Labor's new version of the tax cuts?
Well, what we won't be doing is breaking the commitment that we made to the Australian people in the 2019 federal election and the 2022 federal election, which is also the commitment that the Labor Party and Anthony Albanese made. We will always look to reduce taxes where we can and keep our promises, and we'll look closely at this package and see what is sustainable and affordable.
Look, Labor claims that this is a political wedge for the Liberals, for Peter Dutton, that if you don't support their tax cuts, Labor will then argue you don't want low-income earners to have more tax relief. How will you handle this?
Well, part of it's right. It's definitely political. I mean, it was so cynical that they briefed out to the media today the number of households in Dunkley where there's an upcoming by-election who will benefit and who will lose. So they have the Department of Treasury going and costing the people affected in a by-election must-win seat. I mean, that just shows how cynical this is. We'll call it out for what it is, which is a total lie by the Prime Minister, which shatters his trustworthiness with the Australian people, and it means he cannot rely on anything that he commits to in the future.
Well, he's counting on the fact that voters will forgive his broken promise because he's helping the majority of Australians with bigger tax cuts. Do you think that assessment has merit, or do you think the reverse could be true, that even if low-income earners get an extra $18 a week, they could still no longer trust the PM?
Well, how can they have confidence in anything he ever commits to again in the future? He can't possibly commit more emphatically than he did to the stage 3 tax cuts, which he and the Treasurer did on more than 100 occasions, and he said that his word was his bond in relation to these things. So no promise the Prime Minister or his government ever makes can ever be taken at face value ever again.
Look, he also announced today a reheated version of Kevin Rudd's policy from January 2008 during the GFC, that there'd be an ACCC inquiry, year-long investigation into supermarkets and their prices. Is this another political tactic to blame the supermarkets for the cost of living crisis we're in?
Well, he's not only reheating Kevin Rudd's policies, he's reheating Kevin Rudd's ministers by using Craig Emerson, who was responsible for the failed grocery watch scheme in the Rudd years, which did nothing to reduce grocery prices. Right now, he's promising to increase prices paid to farmers, but decrease prices that consumers are paid. I'll be very impressed to see if he can carry off even one of those things, if not both of them.
Look, just 30 seconds. What is your reaction to the shocking vandalism of a Captain Cook statue in Melbourne today?
It shows shocking historical ignorance among many young people in our community. We're a great country. We're a better country because we were settled by the British on the 26th of January 1788. And where would we be if we didn't have those great institutions of Western civilization? We're not a perfect country, but that's worth celebrating.
All right, James Patterson, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And to you and everyone else watching, have a wonderful Australia Day tomorrow. Hope you have a great time with your family, with the kids, at the beach, at the barbecue. This is all we've got time for tonight. I'll see you Monday at 8 o'clock. And right now, here's Paul Murray.